BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast in which we are looking at turning points in history. And today we're looking at one of the greatest turning points of all, though this time it is not climate change, or perhaps it was climate change. To ask that and to talk about that, I am thrilled to welcome to this virtual studio Andrea Wulf, author of, well, certainly two very brilliant books, and soon very probably of a third very brilliant book. This is one of them, Magnificent Rebels, a magnificent book. If I tell you it's the story of German Romanticism, it already sounds 100% more boring than this book is, because this book shows you how magnificent these rebels were. This book shows you what a ferment there was, how entire worlds were simply invented anew. And that's what we want to talk about today. Andrea, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Philip.
This is a curious world in which two Germans speak in English about a bunch of Germans who lived at the beginning of the 19th century. Tell me how we came here.
Well, how the two of us came here speaking English, or how we came here to talk about this?
Well, you know, how this situation, what is the interest of German Romanticism, of something that happened at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, to a modern English-speaking world that thinks about a war in Ukraine, that thinks about the climate catastrophe and the future of democracy. Why are we interested in that? Why is this a turning point in history?
Well, I think it is incredibly important, and there's a big paradigm shift that's happening there, which we can still feel today. And I'm not really interested in history just for the sake of history. I'm interested in history because I want to understand why we are who we are today. And I think what happened in German Romanticism at the end of the 18th century in a small German town called Jena has had quite a huge effect on us today, and I think has a big impact also maybe on how we talk about climate change, and we can talk about that more later. So it is also about climate change, although it is about the Romantics at the end of the 18th century. But maybe let me kind of set the scene a little bit, because what happened there rippled out into the English-speaking world, so into Europe and also into America. So this is not just a very weird niche little subject for two Germans who might speak English about this. I think it is something that is actually quite important. So in the 1790s, a group of young, rebellious thinkers, poets, philosophers, writers came together in this small town, Jena, which is about 150 miles southwest of Berlin.
And when you say small town, it really was a small town.
Yeah, it was. It had 4,500 inhabitants. It was a small university town, so very much dominated by its university. Almost 900 students. So quite a huge amount of the population were students. With all that came with student life. So there were publishers, bookbinders, but also a ton of taverns, for example. So this was very much a city geared towards a student population. It was a city where something strange was happening, which for me, I could really see. Like I came across this statistic that a quarter of all children born in Jena at that time were born out of wedlock. So something is definitely going on there. So there's a lot of thinking and rebellious thinking, but there's also a lot of sex and changing lovers and scandals.
They tend to go together, do they?
Yeah, I think so. Also, I suppose because a lot of revolutions are triggered by younger people, so they are still experimenting, and they're still trying to work out how we do this, and they break with conventions. That's part of being rebellious. So all this is happening there, and what interests me was, so I was brought up in Germany, but I've lived in England for almost 30 years, and I was doing some research about Alexander von Humboldt for my previous book. And as I was walking through Jena, who had also been to Jena, as I was walking through Jena, I saw all these name plaques of, I mean, literally all the famous people I had learned in at school: Goethe, Schiller, Hölderlin, Novalis, Fichte, Schelling, the Schlegel brothers, and they all lived there at the same time. So as I was digging into the story, what really surprised me that these are not the kind of haloed gods that we learn about at school. You know, these are kind of real people, you know, warts and all. And I think the English are much better in writing these kind of histories than the Germans. So the Germans very much, when they write about Goethe, it's very much about Goethe's works. And I come more from the Anglo-Saxon tradition, where you look at the people, because in the end of the day, if you look at yourself, I look at myself, like my work is completely shaped through who I am in my daily life, in my personal life. And I think it's the same with historical figures.
Well, that's what makes your book an absolute delight to read. And you're right. I mean, what your book does, it ruins the idea of the stolid, pot-bellied German professor who sits there writing systematic philosophy from morning to evening. You show a very different bunch of people. And yes, that is a very British thing. I've also been, shall we say, socialized intellectually in Britain. And I've also done this experiment of writing about a bunch of people and their thinking. For me, it was the radical philosopher of the Enlightenment. But you learn so much when you begin to equate or to relate people's writing to their lives, to their daily lives, to their personal background. It is such an enriching thing to do. Your eyes are really open. Why do you think that happens so rarely?
In Germany?
Yes.
I always try to explain. So the English word history has the word story in it. And it's really about a narrative storytelling, I think traditionally. And the German word Geschichte has the word Schicht in it, which means layer. So it's almost like this layer upon layer upon layer. We have to kind of unpeel it. It's a very theoretical approach. And in Germany, you get criticized for what I do, for example. So there's some reviewers of books who will say, you almost feel as if you're with the people in Jena. And you think that, yeah. And
that's a criticism.
Yeah, that's their criticism. And I think, thank you for the compliment. This is really nice. I want my readers to kind of smell the streets and see what the people are wearing. And nothing is invented. You can write in a novelistic way without inventing anything. So we have, for example, from this time in Jena, you have all these super famous people who write, thank God, thousands and thousands of letters, because they're writers and poets. These are beautiful letters. But you also have almost 900 students who write letters back to their parents, describing their fabulous, young, rebellious professors and how these lectures are and what exactly happened. So I've never had such a treasure trove of diaries, descriptions, and letters from which you can build the scenes where these people, dinner parties, excursions, summer holidays in Dresden, they all describe it. So you can actually bring it alive if you read enough letters and diaries.
Now, these dinner parties, they're fabulously interesting in themselves. But what makes them interesting for the world? What really happened in this tiny little provincial German nest in these years?
So I think one thing to remember is that Germany at that time, at the end of the 18th century, is not a unified nation. So it's this kind of colorful patchwork of 1,500 states ranging from tiny principalities to big, powerful states such as Austria and Prussia. And Jena is in a very small state, the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar, and which is a state that is headed by a quite enlightened ruler. And not only that, there's the university, which through complicated kind of inheritance law used to be run by one Saxon duke and then by the end of the 18th century, is run by controlled by four different Saxon dukes, with no one really in charge. So what happened there is that professors could teach pretty much whatever they wanted to teach. And that in turn then attracts writers, thinkers, poets, playwrights who have been in trouble with the authorities in their home state. So you have, for example, someone like Friedrich Schiller, who arrives in Jena after he's been arrested for his revolutionary play, The Robbers, in his hometown, the Duchy of Württemberg. He in turn is so famous that he becomes like a magnet for the younger generation. So the more liberally minded people arrive in Jena, the more liberally minded people are arriving there. So you end up with this very unusual situation that you have this small town which is full of kind of incredibly visionary thinkers and writers, and they hang out together.
I would have loved to attend a reading by Schiller of one of his plays, if only because he read them in a heavy Swabian accent,
Yes.
which would have been just about the opposite to its lofty contents and to its great ideals. But you describe something in your book that I've often read, and I think that seems very significant and gets us close to what's happening here. You describe that when The Robbers were staged, one of his plays, a play where a good man becomes a criminal because circumstances are bad. The theater is described like a madhouse, and people sob, people fall into each other's arms, and people faint. Now, why has the theater such power? Here's a thought that I wanted to throw in. Theatre, since classical antiquity, shows individuals that have grown tragically out of sync with the order of the world, with the divine order. They have a character flaw, or they have made a vow that binds them to something that becomes impossible. But usually it's a character flaw. King Lear is too vain, and but Hamlet is too hesitant, etc., and therefore the catastrophe takes its course. And in the end, what we see as the tragedy is that the divine order is restored, and that person is broken and taken out of circulation, and then the world will go on. This also happens to Schiller's figures. They are also broken. But before they die, they say, it's the system that's wrong, not me. And that must have been an absolute earthquake.
Yes, because this, so The Robbers was premiered in 1782, so this is even before the French Revolution. So this is a time when most of Europe is still, in the iron fist of absolutism, when monarchs, when rulers can decide over their subjects' lives, from marriage permissions, what profession they can take. They can sell their subjects as mercenaries. So this idea that the system is the fault, not you, that it can maybe change also this hope, I think is incredibly important. And then I think when we look at the group in Jena, you have the French. I think one can never underestimate the effect of the French Revolution, what that had, the effect on Europeans, thinkers and intellectuals, that it was the most exciting and the most thrilling event ever. There was just across the border, not that far away, the French Revolutionaries proved that ideas could change the world. Because if you're a writer or a poet or a philosopher, your weapons are, are quills and words and books, but not weapons such as guns or swords or something like that. So suddenly something happens in France that proves that ideas are mightier than anything else. And I think this idea that you can change the world with your words was just incredibly empowering.
This also happens in Jena, but describe to us, what are the ideas that really change there? what makes the fulcrum of this revolution that you locate there? Not only you, I mean, the revolution of German Romanticism, that was really terribly important, but that wasn't also quite as provincial as we make it sound when we say German Romanticism. And this includes figures who've actually been among the first to have traveled the entire globe.
Yes. So, for example, Alexander von Humboldt was part of this group. But I think there are two very important things that happen there. One is, which is the importance of the self. And the philosopher who really is the inspiration for them is Fichte, who began to teach in Jena at the university in 1794. And he was so hugely popular that more than half of half of Jena's students would come to his lectures. There were so many there that they didn't all fit in the auditorium. Some were standing on ladders, kind of looking through the windows to see him. So he was hugely popular. They called him the Bonaparte of philosophy. He was very unconventional. He gave his lectures kind of dressed in riding boots, whip in hand. He was feared for his volatile temperament. So for example, which I love, he ate his snuff tobacco rather than inhaling it. He shouted rather than talking. And he developed his ideas in front of his students so they could really see this revolution happening in front of their eyes. And what he basically said is, he put the self at the center of his philosophy.
The human self, what makes an individual.
Yes, so he gave us the most thrilling of all powers, which is free will and self-determination. And he said, there are no absolute or God-given truth. The only certainty we have is that we can understand the world through the self, through our mind. And he said that the source of all reality is the self, and that the self posits its own being. So the self brings itself into existence, and through that he brings into existence, at least in our mind, everything that is not the self. He calls it, so it's the ich and the non-ich. So the non-ich is the other humans, nature, plants, animals. That doesn't mean that the self creates the external world, but it creates our knowledge of the external world. And with that, he gave the ich kind of the agency of everything. So that is the first step for them. And that I think is not to be underestimated. This importance of the self, which then, we can talk about that later, which then obviously leads to us today, this kind of very selfish society, which just circles around ourselves.
People in love with their own opinions because it is themselves who count most.
Yes, so this is the kind of the flip side of this. But when it begins, it is thrilling and exciting and liberating. And the idea of this free self is really that you live a life in which you can determine your path, which was something very, very new at that time. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, which becomes very important for Romanticism, is the unity between self and nature. And the philosopher who's very important there is Friedrich Schelling, a very young philosopher who becomes the youngest professor in Jena at the age of 23. So he's younger than some of his students. And he explains that self and nature is identical. So that instead of kind of dividing the world into living and non-living, or into matter and mind, as philosophers have done for centuries, he says the living and the non-living world are all governed by the same principles, so that everything is one big organism, which is then an idea that becomes very important for Alexander von Humboldt. And it's also an idea, I think, that's very important for our discussions about the climate, about the environment, because we sometimes seem to forget that we are part of nature, not just physically, but also emotionally and psychologically. So I think that is, for me, one of the big and very, very important outcomings from this. And all this becomes Romanticism. And the interesting thing about Romanticism is, I think, that we all have very different definitions of what Romanticism is. There are people who think of paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, lone figures.
Lone figures standing in a wide landscape.
Exactly. Others will say think like candlelit dinners, passionate declarations of love, and all of this was not of any interest for the young romantics, for the first romantics in Jena, because for them, romanticism was something almost undefinable, very complex, very radical.
If there's a bunch of young people, and I really want to come back to that understanding of nature, which you say is so important also today. But I mean, if you've got a bunch of young people, there's always an element of rebellion against an older generation. And this, of course, is the older generation of the Enlightenment. And now I keep saying the Enlightenment is much more interesting and much more complex than people make out. But if we just take what is the conventional idea of the Enlightenment, certainly in Germany at that time, because people didn't read so much English and French philosophy at the time, then it is a way of thinking that is very heavily geared towards rationality, towards the power of reason. But I would also say it is in many ways sort of almost crypto-theological. You can see a very, very strong inheritance of Christianity. So that means we have to free ourselves from our bodies and their instincts and feelings and illusions, and we have to privilege our pure minds to overcome these illusions and come to real insight. Now that has a lot to do with how the Christian soul works, and other ideas of the Enlightenment have a lot to do with a theological heritage. And this human being as sort of reason on two stilts, reason without any emotion, reason without sex, reason without lust, that is something. Reason also without experience, without feeling. That is something that, I mean, Immanuel Kant stands very much for that vision of life. It's not as simple as that, but he's been sort of identified with that. But that is something that they very strongly rebel against.
Yes, although they don't rebel. Well, a lot of people think that the Romantics kind of rebel against reason and that they celebrate irrationality. And I don't think that's true, actually, because there are quite a lot of scientists involved there. So there's Goethe, who's a poet and a scientist. There's Novalis, who's a poet and a mining inspector and a scientist. There is Humboldt, Alexander von Humboldt, who is a scientist who writes like a poet. So I think what they do is I think the big word that's in there for them is imagination. So everything is centered around imagination. They declare imagination as the highest faculty of the mind, which does not mean that they turn against reason, but they say reason alone is not enough. We also need imagination. And I think that is, for me, really what defines the young romantics. And with imagination also comes emotion and feeling, but it doesn't mean that they're only relying on their feelings and their emotions at all. I think they're fighting against a disenchantment of the world, a world that's almost, this is in England, for example, is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So this is a world that in their eyes becomes like a gigantic mill wheel, which is grinding itself to dust.
In how far were they aware of that? Did they write about that, about the Industrial Revolution, about the dark satanic mills and all that?
They don't, not so explicitly, but for example, Novalis describes the Prussian state as functioning like a factory. So they are thinking about this, and they kind of look at modernity. And then people like Schiller, for example, they look eventually when the French Revolution when the Reign of Terror begins in 1792, 1793, and many of them become disillusioned with the French Revolution, with the kind of brutality of it. Someone like Schiller, for example, talks about how it was the Enlightenment, it was the rationality that allowed the French Revolution to become so brutal, because it becomes like this kind of machine. So I think the celebration of imagination becomes something that's very, very important for them. And if we look back so for centuries, imagination was really relegated to a subordinate role in philosophy. People, philosophers like Leibniz or Spinoza would look at imagination with suspicion. This is something that's kind of hiding the truth. You can't quite trust it. And then you have David Hume, for whom imagination becomes more important. Also for Kant, because Immanuel Kant also kind of moves towards the subjective. But then it's the young romantics, I think, who really kind of pull imagination out and say, like, this is important. We need to. And they talk about this also in terms of their connection with nature. They say, like, scientists, look through telescopes and through microscopes to understand the minutiae of life. They kind of classify nature, but no matter how much scientists observe, calculate, experiment, there is a connection between humanity and nature that is unexplainable, that's emotional, that's visceral, that's, and science as such can't explain that, but imagination can.
You've written a wonderful biography of Alexander von Humboldt, a figure who is not wildly known in the English-speaking world, but who was one of the perhaps last universal geniuses that this world has seen. When you talk about the connection between humans and nature, when you talk about the connectedness of nature, because, we think of certainly science at the time was very much in sort of Carl von Linné's way of classifying plants, and everything is put into its own little drawer and gets its own little Latin name, and then it's classified, and basically we no longer have to worry about it. It's done now. Humboldt had a very different approach.
Yes, so Humboldt very much influenced also by his time in Jena. So Humboldt is born in 1769, same year as Napoleon. He was a young, wealthy Prussian whose brother, Wilhelm von Humboldt, lived in Jena in the mid-1790s with all the others. So Alexander, the younger brother, goes very regularly to Jena. And it's through his friendship with Goethe that he kind of changes from being very much an Enlightenment scientist who focuses on observable facts, experiments, scientific instruments, to someone who also realizes that the subjective view is more important. And he says, the time in Jena has given me new organs through which to understand the world. And it's with these new organs that he goes on a 5-year exploration of South America. And he comes back with an idea of nature that very much shapes our thinking today, that nature is this interconnected whole where everything hangs together, from the smallest insect to the tallest tree. And it is something that I think was shaped by what he had seen, by his time in Jena, but also by his travels, because he actually did see all these connections as he was traveling. He saw how similar vegetation zones in the Andes were to some in the Alps or in the Pyrenees, but also through talking to a lot of indigenous people who, of course, see nature as a living organism. So he comes back with this idea that nature is a living organism, and brings to Europe, at least he's the one in Europe who kind of really comes up with this idea that nature is a web of life. So this is the beginning of what we obviously today think of. This is how nature functions. And he writes this very, very famous book, big bestseller, called Cosmos. And at some stage he was considering calling it Gaia, which of course 150 years later,
after James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis,
exactly, their Gaia theory, where Earth is this living organism. And in a way, although Humboldt was forgotten in much of the English-speaking world, his ideas have really informed, I would argue, most ecologists and environmentalists from John Muir. In my book, The Invention of Nature, I talk about 8 people he actually then influences. Someone like John Muir, for example, Henry David Thoreau. John Muir becomes an environmentalist because of the books he read that Humboldt wrote. But also people who don't explicitly maybe quote him, like people like Rachel Carson, for example, in Silent Spring. So you have a lot of people who are influenced by his thinkings. And what I find amazing, so when I do my lecture, I do a lot of lecture tours through America and through Europe, and there are a lot of younger people who literally fall in love with Alexander von Humboldt, because he was a scientist who wrote like a poet. He sketched the natural world, so he was an artist. He's really the inventor of infographics. So in order to, because he believed that science, that knowledge should be democratized, so he found ways to visualize very complex scientific data. So he's a hell of an explorer also. So you have the adventure, but you also, and he predicts harmful human-induced climate change in 1800 because of what he saw in South America, how nature was destroyed. He made these connections. He said, so, well, if nature is this kind of web of life, this tapestry, if you pull one thread, the whole thing might unravel.
It seems quite a new thought when you think about today's discussions about collapsing biodiversity, perhaps. But this brings us to a very neat paradox that you and I both know. You read historical texts, and they're written by people who are children of that time, for other people at that time. And they often seem to have pretty arcane preoccupations. The German Romantics talk endlessly about a natural religion and how that is supposed to be like. And you see, this is very much a preoccupation of their day. How do you translate that into something that speaks to us today?
Well, interestingly, because you were just saying the natural religion, and you say that seems arcane, but look at a lot of kind of more kind of New Age kind of ideas. There are a lot of people who kind of go back to these ideas, like, how do I find myself in nature? So I think we look at, and you've done this obviously too, so we look at people, historical figures who we think might offer a window into something that is relevant today. So, and I think as such, each generation of historians will find other figures that are interesting for our time. So Alexander von Humboldt, for example, has been written about before, but I think I was the first who kind of really argued that he's the forgotten father of environmentalism. That doesn't mean that he was a political activist. He wasn't, but he kind of came up with these ideas, which then later generations were not interested anymore because they, no one really cared for the environment. But right now, he kind of hits something that is very relevant in our lives today. So I think, and the same with the Romantics. They are. I should have written the books the other way around. I should have written The Magnificent Rebels first and then Humboldt, but it never works like this because I stumbled over them while I was writing Humboldt, because they basically prepare the kind of intellectual framework in which Humboldt then develops his ideas. But I think there are obviously things they write about which might not be interesting for us today, but this whole preoccupation with the unity between self and nature, I think, is incredibly important today. Their focus on imagination is really important for me. So there's something, when you look at the climate change debate today, very rarely do we talk about imagination or feelings. What we talk about are statistics, projections, numbers, which and I am not turning against the scientific method here at all. Quite the opposite. I'm saying the Romantics did both, science and the emotions. So I think we also need to have poets, filmmakers, writers talking about this, not just physicians, not just physicists, scientists, politicians, geoengineers, because we need to find different ways of convincing people to change their behavior. And sometimes it works better not through numbers. And there are endless examples. So, for example, if, we all know how terrible oil production is, but sometimes it's the bird which is kind of drenched in black oil. That kind of makes people kind of wake up and go like, oh my God, this is just terrible. And I think, it's visual, it's emotional, it's not a number.
Is there a work of art that has had this sort of Schiller moment for you? Not that you fainted when you saw it, but I mean, there have been works recently that have tried to tackle this directly. Many other things, other works of art have that indirectly, but if you think of a novel like Overstory, for instance, by Richard Powers, a novel that is about the relationships between people and trees. And do you think that artists today can step up to the plate? Is that asking too much of them?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a very fine balance. So I think there's some... So Overstory, I think, is absolutely brilliant. We call it cli-fi, the climate fiction. And I think it's been... There are some which are terrible because it can't be didactic. And I think, writers have to kind of get into how to do this, because sometimes you have in a book, you have like two climate scientists talking to each other and you think that this is not believable. No one can explain to another climate scientist what, carbon emissions are. But obviously you somehow need to have this information there. But I think it's sometimes much, much more subtle than this. It's just that what happens to our world somehow has to be reflected in art. Sometimes the very direct stuff works. So, for example, there's an artist, Danish artist, now I've forgotten his name, Olafur Eliasson, who brought these huge blocks of Arctic ice to Copenhagen, Paris, and London to create this almost tangible artwork of the melting of the poles. And for me, that was an incredible piece of art and something very direct, very literal almost in a way, but unbelievably powerful. So I think artists will have to find ways to do this. Sometimes I think it's just about creating something that might encourage people to fall in love with nature again, because we are only going to protect what we love in the end of the day.
There's a wonderful work that I saw that I think your German romantics would have loved, or perhaps that would have particularly appalled them. A young Dutch artist called Noah Jansma, who has set up a project called By Cloud. And she projects clouds on a wall, and an algorithm has calculated their density, and then they get a price tag and a QR code, and you can buy that cloud. And then it goes into a digital sky where the bigger clouds eat the smaller ones, and you can see what happens to your investment. I thought that was fantastic because, yes, clouds are the last space of romanticism in nature. We have pretty much domesticated all nature that is on Earth. No forest is a forest anymore, etc. But clouds are still that wild thing that goes around in the sky, and somehow that has now also been made part of the great market, if only for an art project. But of course it hasn't, because clouds are already speculation objects for agriculture and so. But when you look at this romantic revolution that was also rebellion against, shall we say, an industrial logic of life, in which things are products and everything is rational and has a value you can attach to it, and imagination is really not necessary. What do you think, what are they telling us today across a century and a half or 2 centuries?
I think history is not a dusty old pile of ideas. So I think history tells us something that's important for us today. What I find more difficult is to say, what does this exactly, what would they say if they see this today or something like that? I get this question.
But that's as stupid as the question, what did the artist want to say with this?
I don't know if I can actually say it so directly. For me, this idea that that I've always been interested in groups, what they can do, what they can change, because we don't exist as an individual just on our own, and and if you look back if it's the French thinkers in the Enlightenment, or the Scottish Enlightenment in Edinburgh, or the American Transcendentalists in Concord, Massachusetts, you have always these kind of, or the Bloomsbury set, you always have these kind of groups of people who are, in a way, a product of their time. So, but they are attracted to each other. And they magnify their ideas also, because there's always a bit of competition going on. So one has to be kind of, cleverer, smarter, better painter, better actor, or something like that than the other one. So, but I think for me, the important thing is that great ideas only happen in groups, really, I think.
When you say that, one aspect of this group was, perhaps a more typical aspect than we think today, because, as with the Enlightenment, that has become a sort of projection from the 19th century backwards into history. In the Enlightenment as we know it today is largely the invention of 19th century historians. But so much of history is the invention of historians who, of course, wanted to prove something to their own audience, who wrote for their own day. And we know that women have been quite systematically written out of history. They happen to have been quite important for this bunch of people, not only because of the charming presence of sex, but also because they were very much thinkers in their own right.
Yes, and I think, you're very right. So they get written out of history, especially in these groups. Very often, it's the man, and then you think, well, where were all the women here? And we tend to describe these women often then just as a muse. The painter's muse, the poet's muse. And very often they are much more than that. So,
meaning basically she slept with him when he was busy, when he was finished with his genius.
So in Jena, you have a few very strong women. And the one who really stands out is Caroline Michaelis Böhmer Schlegel-Schelling. So 4 surnames. One is her father's name, 3 are the names of her 3 husbands, who really stands at the center of this group. She was quite an extraordinary woman. So she was born in 1763. She was the daughter of one of Germany's very famous scholars in Göttingen. So she was brought up in a household where books, literature, politics, poetry was kind of very much the center. She was highly educated, so she spoke several languages fluently. And she was nonetheless, she was independently minded. She was, strong-minded, but nonetheless, she was, as so often, married off when she was quite young, when she was 20. By the time she was 24, she was a widow. There were some friends who kind of found some suitable husbands, and she was like, no way, I'm really enjoying myself here.
Been there, done that, thanks very much.
So she was very unhappily married. And then she had 3 children from that marriage. 2 died, but 1 survived. And then she began to hang out with the German revolutionaries in Mainz, and was then imprisoned by the Prussians for being a sympathizer with the French Revolution, and had to go to prison with her 7-year-old daughter for several months. But not only that, in prison she discovered that she was pregnant after a one-night stand with an 18-year-old French soldier. So quite scandalous at a time when, you're not really supposed to even be alone with a man in a room. So she, after her imprisonment, she kind of zigzags through Germany. She's called a revolutionary whore, and then eventually August Wilhelm Schlegel, who's a young writer then, marries her. And it's really a marriage of convenience for her. So no great love. No great love. I mean, he loved her deeply, but she didn't. But he's an art critic. He's super smart. He's good looking. He's kind. He gives her a new name, and with that, a new beginning. And they come to this arrangement that they have this open marriage. And August Wilhelm Schlegel then takes her to Jena, where she becomes really the heart and soul of this group. She creates the physical space where they meet and hang out and party, but she's also very much at the intellectual center of this group. So she writes reviews under her husband's name. She's the editor of their literary magazine. And together with Schlegel, she translates the first German verse translation of Shakespeare. 16 Shakespeare plays they publish. Her name to this day is still missing from the cover. It's called now the Schlegel-Tieck edition, but really it should be the Schlegel-Tieck edition. She was very much part of that, and August Wilhelm Schlegel very much relied on her for his reviews, for his ideas. He writes his published lectures on Shakespeare, for example, are deeply informed by his discussions with Caroline. Those then get translated into English and become very important for the British Romantics, because Shakespeare was quite unpopular at the beginning of the 17th century. I mean, Voltaire calls Hamlet the work of a drunken savage. Shakespeare is seen as this chaotic, unnatural, compared to the kind of French, more formal, classic kind of drama. It's just mad and wild and far too human. And the Romantics in England kind of rediscover Shakespeare through August Wilhelm and Caroline Schlegel's translation. So she's really important for this group. She very much shapes the thinking of Friedrich Schlegel, who's the younger brother of August Wilhelm Schlegel, who's also in love with her. But she makes them all quite excited about the French Revolution, for example. And then she becomes the lover and later the wife of Friedrich Schelling, who was 12 years younger than she was. And again, she's much more than just a muse for him.
There is one other woman that I can't resist mentioning, because she's another one of these characters that have sort of almost vanished from history but were absolute superstars in their own time, Madame de Staël. Which also shows you the international dimension of this revolution. You've now talked about Shakespeare translations. You've talked about the influence on English and American Romanticism, but here's also a very powerful relation with France through a woman who, again, really blasted her own way. There was no way of being Madame de Staël before she came along.
Yes, so she was the daughter of the French finance minister, and but it was a great supporter of the revolution, but then fell really badly out with Napoleon, and Napoleon exiles her, so she lives in Switzerland, and she becomes quite obsessed with what's happening in Jena, so much so that she travels to Weimar and Jena to find out what's going on there. So by the time she arrives, though, at the end of 1803, most of them are gone. And Goethe and Schiller entertain her in Weimar and are for 11 weeks and are pretty exhausted by her, because she's this kind of like whirlwind who just asks questions the whole time. And when she leaves, Schiller says something like, he feels as if he's just gone out of survived an illness. But Goethe basically then says to her, well, if you really want to understand what happened with the young romantics here in Jena, you need to go to Berlin and you need to meet August Wilhelm Schlegel, which she does, and they hit it off and get on. And she employs him as the tutor for her two sons. And he lives with her for the next, I think, 13 years. And she writes a book called On Germany, which becomes a huge bestseller. It's banned in France because Napoleon was not pleased about a book that effectively says everything that happened in Germany is much better than what happened in France, because, French literature, obviously much better than German literature. So she's the one who coins this phrase, Germany, this nation of thinkers and poets and thinkers, I think it's that. Yeah, poets and thinkers. And August Wilhelm, of course, is very, very much part of the production of this book. And it's a book that's published in English, and that really helps to disseminate this kind of ideas across Europe, in England and America. So even if you are an American, you can't read German, which a lot of American thinkers at that time could read German, they would read On Germany. and they would kind of learn what was happening with the young romantics.
Now you've got a bunch of wonderfully intellectually unconventional people in one place in a tiny little provincial town in Germany. Why does this qualify as a turning point in history? How did the world become different through what happened there?
Well, I think for two things. One is the importance of the self. I think Fichte's philosophy has placed the self at the center of everything, where it has stayed for the better or the worse. I think that we, ever since he did that, we have had, to deal with this kind of tension between the breathtaking possibilities of free will and the pitfalls of selfishness. And it's a balancing act which we continue to walk to this day. And I think underlining all this are two questions, which is, who am I as an individual and who am I as a member of a society? So how can I live a fulfilled life and at the same time can I be a morally good person? How can I also be, how can I reconcile my personal liberties with the demands of a society? And the pandemic is a great example for that. Some of us, most of us, giving up our basic rights because we thought it's the right thing to do for the greater good. So we kept to lockdown regulations and stuff like that. But a few didn't, said like, no, my personal liberty is more important. And I think it's this balancing act that began then. And I think there's a paradigm shift since then. So the interesting thing is that Fichte always said that this freedom, this free will, comes with moral obligations. So it always comes. So freedom comes with its twin, which is our moral obligations. So this is not going to work if we just do whatever we want.
Sorry to interrupt you, but that's really fascinating because we live in a time where freedom is such an important word. In the United States, it's basically gospel. Liberty is what everything is about. It can justify just about everything. But also here it has become so important. I have always the vivid impression that most people have no idea what freedom is and how it can work. That it's not just I want to do whatever the hell I want. Freedom philosophically is so much more of a difficult concept because it comes with these obligations, because your freedom always bumps up against the freedom of someone else. There was already Hegel who had basically said your only freedom is to delegate your freedom to the state and take from the state what it will give you. So these are huge and very topical questions, and I want to. As my last question, I want to come to something that is really of great importance to me. I've written a little book in which I tried to look at, funnily enough, the importance of the imagination in a time of crisis. And yes, imagination is enormously important when you want to, or indeed need to, imagine a different world, imagine a world differently, when you need to begin to move out to how you think that things are normal and have to construct a different world. We seem to stand in front of this task almost powerlessly because the world seems so cemented in its ways that we can't possibly conceive of seeing it differently. What we seem to be lacking is also sources for inspiration, sources to draw inspiration from, to give us perhaps a helping hand to develop this imagination. Where did the inspiration of the Romantics come from? What did they read? What did they encounter that gave them new ideas?
Well, I think they were all deeply influenced by Immanuel Kant, because effectively, to boil it down very simply, I think effectively what he said is, we are citizens of two worlds. One is the external world. One is the internal world. One is the Ding the thing in itself, das Ding an sich, which is the external world, which Kant said we will never truly understand because we see it through the lens almost of our mind, of the categories in our mind: space, time, causality. It's almost like sunglasses we wear through which we see the world. Which on the one hand could be something quite frustrating, but on the other hand, it gave the subjective view a much stronger kind of much greater importance. So they were deeply influenced by that, but Fichte was unhappy about the still existing dualism between, the mind and matter. But I think it was without that they would have not arrived where they arrived. Schelling, Spinoza was very, very important. This idea that everything is one substance, God and nature is one, which then becomes for him the self and nature is one. So I think that's very, very important. They all loved Goethe. Goethe was very, very important. Young Werther, with this emphasis on emotions and also the self, of course. Suicide in a way is the ultimate power of the self, because you can take your own life.
They had amongst them two of the most widely traveled people in the world, Georg Foster and Alexander von Humboldt. People who were, Foster traveled with Captain Cook. They saw not only new plants and new landscapes, they also saw new cultures, and they were both minded to take them seriously, not to think of these people as savages who hadn't yet been blessed with civilization, but as people who had something to say, people who had a genuine understanding of the world. Did that reach little Jena?
I think so. It's very interesting that you asked this, because I'm just working on Georg Foster at the moment.
Here's my next question.
So, I think it's exactly that. It's his search for humanity. It's that, who are we as different people, but we are still all humans. So Georg Foster, as a 17-year-old, sees these all these kind of South Pacific islanders, and unlike very, very many other explorers and Europeans, does not see them as barbarians or as Rousseau, as like the noble savages, but as people, and writes incredibly unbiased about them. I have not come across the Jenas as actually writing about this specifically, but Friedrich Schlegel, for example, writes an essay about Georg Foster 3 years after Foster died in 1794, which is one of the most public acknowledgements of Foster as a great German thinker at a time when Georg Foster, because he was a revolutionary in the Mainz Republic, at a time when most Germans saw him as a traitor. So that's very important. And also, and I think that's not to be underestimated, Georg Foster, for example, he translates a Sanskrit drama, which Herder loves, which the young romantics love. So this idea of another culture is very important. And then Schlegel, both Schlegel brothers are very interested in India and Sanskrit studies. So there's an open-mindedness, I think, in all of them, which, interestingly, some of them become quite reactionary when they get older. But when they are young, as so often, the young revolutionaries are much more open-minded than the older ones.
Andrea, I have about 1,000 more questions, beginning with Alexander's brother Wilhelm and his language philosophy. But listen, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. It's always fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so very much that you were my guest today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening. And if you enjoy the BlomCast, then do subscribe. And most of all, do send me questions, send me suggestions, send me angry rebuttals, send me whatever you want. But do get in touch. I like to talk to you. And if you've got an idea about what you'd like to hear about, I'm sure I'll try to do my best. So be in touch and subscribe. And Andrea Wulf, author of, amongst other, Magnificent Rebels, and I think quite soon, very possibly, a biographer of Georg Foster.
It'll be like another 4 years or so, I think.
One book I'm hugely looking forward to, Andrea. Thank you very much, and I hope we'll speak very soon again. Bye-bye.
Bye.